Welcome back to Between the Lines. Today we analyze The Color of the Grave is Green by Emily Dickinson. The color of the grave is green. The outer grave, I mean. You would not know it from the field, except it own a stone. To help the fond to find it, too infinite a sleep, to stop and tell them where it is, but just a daisy deep. The color of the grave is white, the outer grave, I mean. You would not know it from the drifts in winter, till the sun has furrowed out the aisles. Then, higher than the land, the little dwelling houses rise, where each has left a friend. The color of the grave within, the duplicate, I mean. Not all the snows could make it white, not all the summers green. You've seen the color, maybe upon a bonnet bound, when that you met it with before, the ferret cannot find. This is an amazing poem, isn't it? This poem, which I mentioned in my color symbolism video, has pulled me in so many directions. It is at a glance a contemplation upon death that uses the common symbolisms of color and seasons to establish various perspectives of death. We'll do this analysis in 5 layers, each taking on one dimension of the poem. First, we'll look at the literal meaning. Then we'll look at form. After that, we'll break down the poetic devices to find a deeper meaning. Next, we will look briefly at the significance of seasons in the poem. And finally, we'll briefly explore the colors of the poem in relation to how Dickinson uses these colors in her poetry on a whole. Reading 1. The literal meaning. Let us read the poem stanza by stanza and find out what's happening on the surface level. After that, we will look a little deeper. In stanza 1, it is said that the grave's color is green, but it is clarified that this is the color of the outer grave. We'll soon get back to why this is called the outer grave. Symbolism aside, why would the grave be colored green? Lines 3 and 4 make that clear. It is because it is in a green field, and it is covered and hidden by greenery. Line 3 tells us that it would be impossible to identify a grave when it is hidden by grasses and flowers of the field. The only way you would be able to identify a grave in a flourishing field is if there were a gravestone attached to it. Since the stone protrudes from the ground, it could be used as a marker. This marker in the beginning of stanza 2 is used to help the fond, in line 5, to find the grave. The fond must be the loved ones, those who were fond of whoever's grave they're looking for. In the next 2 lines, the obvious is stated. The dead people are in the infinite sleep of death, and so they can't help the searchers to find their graves. Instead, they should rely on a gravestone. The sleep of death is further modified in line 8, and is said to be as deep as a daisy, a flower that sends roots deep into the ground, and one that is often found in graveyards. The whiteness of the daisy provides a smooth transition into the next phase of the poem, in which the grave is said to be white. The contrast of green and white, and as we'll soon see of grass and snow, emphasizes a change of season. That said, let's take a step back into the first 2 stanzas and recognize that these stanzas are set either in spring or summer. Spring seems more likely for the moment, but later on we will see that it's actually summer. We see a flowering field that is green enough to cover the graves. We will look at the significance of the seasons in an upcoming phase of the analysis. But for now, let's press on to the end and get through the literal meaning of the poem. In stanza 2, the color of this same outer grave is no longer green, but now white. You would not know it from the drifts in winter until the sun comes out. The drifts must be the drifts of snow, or blankets of snow. Line 12 does confirm that it is wintertime. The snow hides the grave just as the grass hid them in the summer. The snow, however, is a bit more menacing, as it hides even the gravestones if it snows hard enough. What makes it possible to then identify the grave is the sun coming out and melting the snow. In the next stanza, we see the image that the melted snow reveals. The aisles have been furrowed out, line 13, meaning the columns and rows, the grid lines of the cemetery can now be clearly seen. The little dwelling houses that are a little higher than the land, lines 14-15, might be the uncovered gravestones. They might also be the graves themselves, which could easily be considered little houses for the dead. In line 5, we enter a third phase, but not quite a third identifiable season. Now we are talking about the color of the grave within. So before, we were talking about the color of the visible concrete or granite on the surface or outside of the grave, while now we are talking about the inside of the grave. Yet it is as if we still have not yet reached the ultimate grave, as this one is merely a duplicate. My thoughts fork into two possibilities here. Literally, the duplicate grave could be the large concrete grave that is a duplicate of the coffin in which the body is actually buried. But this might not be right, because we are discussing, according to line 17, the grave within. That leads me to the second possibility, which is that the grave within is the coffin, which is a duplicate of the outer grave. Stanza 5 says that the color of this inner grave, the coffin, in my interpretation, is unaffected by the changing seasons. But what is the color of this inner grave? Instead of being as direct as she has been for the green and white, the speaker gives us a hint as to what this color is. She says we might find it on a bonnet. Black bonnets are often worn by women who are in mourning and who are visiting graves. So the color of this inner grave seems to be black. It is a grave that is not just unaffected by the outside, but it is also inaccessible to those on the outside. We can see and touch the outer grave, but we cannot see and touch the coffin within. So out of reach the inner grave is that not even ferrets, which are incredibly apt hunters, can find them. Reading 2. Let's take a look at the poem's form. The poem is fairly regular. Stanzas are uniform in length. In fact, it is conspicuously regular when you look at the number of syllables in each line, except for the first lines of each stanza, which fluctuate from 6 to 8 syllables. The consistency is perfect, in that every second line has 6 syllables, every third line has 8 syllables, and every fourth line has 6 syllables. This is important. The first line of each stanza represents the outer grave. These lines, which introduce each stanza, can be imagined as the outer lines, and they are variable, adjustable, inconsistent, much as the outer grave can change in color and condition as seasons come and go. However, the second through fourth lines represent the inner grave, which remains unchanged, regardless of what transpires on the outside. Let's do something weird. To see how rhythmic the poem becomes when we strip it of its outer layer, let's reread the poem without the first lines of each stanza. The outer grave, I mean, you would not know it from the field, except it own a stone. Too infinite asleep, to stop and tell them where it is, but just a daisy deep. The outer grave, I mean, you would not know it from the drifts in winter till the sun. Then higher than the land, the little dwelling houses rise, where each has left a friend. The duplicate, I mean. Not all the snow could make it white, not all the summer's green, upon a bonnet bound, when that you met it with before the ferret cannot find. It is as if structurally the poem is telling us that the outer grave must be removed in order for the truth to be found. The outer grave is messy, weathered by snow and rain and sun and animals, but the inner grave is beautiful, true, untouched. Having stripped the poem of its outer grave, we have uncovered a wonderful lattice of iambic trimeters and iambic tetrameters. In each stanza we have trimeter, tetrameter, trimeter, which is closely resembling the form of a ballad. It is like we have just uncovered a song. Just for fun, if we read only the second and fourth lines, we end up with a poem entirely in iambic trimeter. The outer grave, I mean, except it own a stone, too infinite asleep, but just a daisy deep. The outer grave, I mean, in winter till the sun, then higher than the land, where each has left a friend. The duplicate, I mean, not all the summer's green, upon a bonnet bound, the ferret cannot find. But it is the uncovered combination and interplay between the two meters that makes this poem's form unique and incredibly exciting. Also, there's a sense of progression as the rhythm takes us from color to color, from season to season. We are progressing deeper into the grave, deeper into the understanding of the nature of death. There are end rhymes here and there. The end rhymes might serve as a sort of poetic quantum entanglement, which highlights connections between certain words. For example, deep is paired with sleep in stanza 2 to emphasize how infinitely deep the sleep is. The apparent emergence of the gravestones from the earth is made to resemble a kind of resurrection, as isles pair with rise in stanza 4. This is reminiscent of the biblical imagery of the saints rising from the graves, and the church walking down the aisle to meet their bridegroom, Christ. Before we jump over to doing a deep reading, let's talk a minute about tone. The tone of the poem seems to be both reflective and instructive. Not only is the speaker reflecting on the color or the nature of death, but she's teaching us same. The structure and regularity, the brilliantly hidden deliberateness of the form resembles that of a lesson plan. As a teacher, I often use this technique of hidden deliberateness to create the dual reality in which students can experience surprise and organic unfoldings that appear to occur happily and incidentally, while I actually have ultimate control and foreknowledge of the lesson. Reading 3. Finding Deeper Meaning. Now that we have gathered the literal happenings of the poem and have assessed the poem's form, let us look into some poetic elements. In particular, we must speculate the meaning of the many images, metaphors, and symbols. In this step, we'll not go too deeply into the meaning of the seasons and colors, since they, respectively, will be handled in the subsequent sections. Back to stanza 1. If you're tired, grab a coffee, because the real analysis is just getting started. What is the meaning of examining the color of the grave? What is the significance of this quest? It might mean examining the nature of death. As we see colors, logically, the color of death is a way in which we see death. Similarly, as we experience seasons, each season is a way in which we experience death. But as I said, we will look at what the colors and seasons mean later on. For now, let us pay attention to what the outer grave could mean. We already have the literal meaning, but it must be a metaphor for something. Seeing the color of the outer grave might mean being only able to develop a superficial understanding of death. We can only see its outer layer, being a remote onlooker. We can never understand it at its core. Seeing the colors of the outer grave could also mean that we can only see death from the outside. After all, none of us who now contemplate death has ever experienced it, in the sense, of course, that we have never been dead. Therefore, we can only speculate as to what death looks and feels like. In lines 3 and 4, we see that unless there's a gravestone, we would not be able to find the grave in the field. What is the meaning of this? Perhaps it is that we do not recognize or care about death until we are affected by it. Death is all around us, like this field. It happens every day, but we don't wake up and grieve every day for people who we don't know. We only see death when there's a stone. Remember, it is on the gravestone that the dead person's name and perhaps epitaph is written. It is this personalization that makes us care about death. In the vast field of ubiquitous death, only certain death, those with the stones, catch our eyes. The first and second stanzas also highlight the fact that we eventually move on from and even forget about the death of loved ones. The fact that you need to spot a stone to remember where your loved one is buried means that their death is not fresh in your mind. Stanza 2 seemed ridiculously obvious when we read it literally, but it now indicates that those who are dead, those who are infinitely asleep and cannot point us to their grave, have lost the power to make us care about them. They can no longer love us, and because there is now no love to be reciprocated, we can no longer love them. Eventually, they are forgotten altogether. In stanza 3, the color of the outer grave changes with the season. If the season represents the stages of our lives, then we can easily understand that as we get older, as we change seasons, our view of death also changes. Of course, we are still dealing with the outer grave. This is important to remember, because it indicates that while our attitude toward death may change over time, death itself, the inner grave, remains constant. The seasonal change from summer to winter and the chromatic change from green to white may indicate our growth from youth to maturity. The greenness of youth is replaced by the whiteness and grayness of our hair, and the heat and vibrance of summer is replaced by the stability and stillness of seniority. But more on the colors and seasons later. It goes on in stanza 3 to say that we cannot make out the grave until the sun clears away the snow. The grave being covered by snow might indicate that in our older days we have become cold toward death. We have grown so accustomed to death that we can no longer see it. But as we read on, we see that eventually the sun comes out and reveals death to us again. But the undertone of stanza 4 makes a curious shift. This time, as the grave is revealed, we can see some language of movement. The sun, which is a heavenly body, makes death clear for us. The aisles have been furrowed out in line 13. Aisle here is used in the place of row or column or line. We walk down aisles. An aisle is a pathway. Finally, we're not just seeing death, but we are now moving towards it. In the next two lines, we see the graves rising up, indicating a resurrection. As we enter the penultimate stanza, we can finally get to understand the grave within. This could be because we ourselves have died, and now know what death is. We finally have first-hand experience. But why is this death only a duplicate? We know that literally, the duplicate indicates that the coffin and the grave are very similar. But on this deeper level, saying this is a duplicate grave could mean that the death we have experienced is not the true ultimate death, but only a shadow of death, or a sort of replica, a sleep. Since we have been resurrected, it could mean that the true death might have been one from which there would have been no resurrection, or one from which there would have been a resurrection, but not necessarily to an ascension. We know that this time there's an upward movement from words like sun, which indicates heaven, and rise, which indicates going to heaven. And what can we learn about this duplicate death? In lines 19 and 20, we learn that this death is neither green nor white. So whatever we saw death to be in our youth was incorrect, and whatever we saw death to be in our old age was also incorrect. There is no way to understand death not having died. In this last stanza, we see the color of death. It is the color that we see on a bonnet. It's black. Reading 4. Seasons. We have already touched on the seasons of the poem, so this section will be very short. There are 3 seasons here. The first 2 stanzas give us summer, and the next 2 stanzas give us winter. We'll look at the third season in a minute. The summertime represents our youth, in which death is seen as green. When we are young, death happens almost as a precursor to life. Just as dying seeds bring forth an entire meadow of flowers, so as we watch the older generation die, we thrive in greenery. Parents get old and die and leave inheritances for their children. One generation sinks and the next one rises. Death is green because death creates life. In the next 2 stanzas, the shoe is on the other foot. We are now in winter and we are old. Winter often represents death in poetry, as plants shrivel and animals hibernate. The cold of winter is the embrace of death. And thirdly, we go into the season of not just death, but post-death. This season is not one of the 4 cardinal seasons, as those seasons represent our life in this world, which has ended with winter. This is a black season. While black might seem to be darkness and death, here it might be an enlightenment, truth, oneness. If each color is a perspective on death, then black is the truth about death, the objective truth. Black is not a color. Rather, it is what appears when all colors have been absorbed, consumed. It is what is left when no color is reflected. This season is one in which we know all things objectively. When we die, we will be stripped of our flawed notions and opinions, and we will understand and become a part of this objective truth. In the final section that we'll start in a moment, we will look more deeply at this black, as well as the other colors in this poem. Reading 5. The colors. Let's for a moment zoom out of the poem and look at Dickinson's poetry on a whole. Stay focused because things will get a little bit more complicated from here on. I will reference some other poems to build some arguments, citing their respective numbers as they're labeled in the complete collection of Dickinson's poems, which I will link below. A general knowledge of Dickinson's works and style does make this poem easier to decipher, but it is of course not a prerequisite to undertaking the analysis. Stick with me and you won't get lost. Scanning the vast spectrum of Dickinson's works, we see that she explores various attitudes towards and perspectives of death. Sometimes death is the great equalizer, other times it is a personal enemy. It has also been a savior that relieves suffering. In some works, death is simply a fact of life. These, we can imagine, are the various colors of death. But this poem is trying to find out not a relative, opinionated, subjective color, but the color. What is death really? The poem microcosmically represents some of the colors of death that several other Dickinson poems talk about, in a quest to find the true objective color. Adding to what we have already speculated, let us explore what else the colors in the poem, green, white, and black, could mean, and look at how these colors operate in the broader scheme of Emily's poetry. Green. Green is prevalent in poetry, but surprisingly uncommon in Dickinson's poems. It appears too commonplace, neutral, and frankly undramatic to vividly call to mind particular emotional experiences. It is some sort of default color of nature. When Dickinson does mention green, it usually hints at rest and stasis. On the other hand, when she needs to indicate something more emotional or memorable, she shifts to a more qualified green, usually emerald, which captures a brilliant gem-like quality. We see this in poem 138 of her collection, and also in poems 161, 219, 375, 460, 558, 697, 1463, 1520, and 1593. Yes, Dickinson wrote many poems. I can't get into proving it now, but these uses of emerald typically indicate some strong emotion or memorable quality, while plain old green is linked to something dormant, static. Of course, this contradistinction is not a hard rule, but rather a loose pattern that might suggest underlying functions of the greens of Dickinson. So in this poem, linking death to green actually makes complete sense, considering that this is Dickinson's green. White. In some models of color theory, white is a combination of all colors. Emily often uses white to symbolize totality, completion, and perfection. She also links white to God in a few of her poems. She even calls God the White Creator in poem 709. This makes sense in the poem, as it is God, represented by the wintry sun in stanza 3, that brings death to us, and who brings us into an understanding of death. But just as 0 is the perfect and ultimate number, Emily uses white to represent a snowy, frigid nothingness, not that of death, but that of the absence of life. It is not the emptiness left after life ends, but the vacuum that exists before life even begins. This could indicate that even in our old age, we are yet to begin life. We are only born at death, when the gates to the afterlife are open to us. Black. Even though black and blackness pervade literature, this color is visibly underused in Dickinson's poetry. In fact, running a search through her entire collection of poems shows that she uses the word only 8 times. Green, by the way, is used 14 times. To give some perspective, blue is used 30 times, yellow 35 times, and purple 58 times. Now back to black. Usually, she uses black to refer not to death, but rather to our response to death, particularly mourning, grief, and more physically, the garb of grief, the clothes we wear while mourning. In line 22, black is linked to the bonnet. Have a look at poem 104 in her collection. The same black bonnet appears and serves the same function. The black represents not loss itself, but our response to loss. Not death, but how we relate to it. And that puts a tight lid on this entire poem that explores how we see and understand death throughout the different seasons of our lives. How obsessed we are with understanding this mysterious force, which in the end gives meaning to life. As always, thanks for watching.